Hello and welcome to Social Value UK's webinar on the 10 impact questions. This webinar will provide an introduction to the different impact questions, highlighting the benefits of answering each and the potential risks of not doing so. This is framed by the principles of social value that underpin all of the work undertaken by Social Value UK. As a little bit of background about Social Value UK, before we get into some of the detail around what we mean by social value and the different impact questions, SVUK is a national network that represents members, individuals and organisations who share a mission to change the way the world accounts for value. By changing how we account for value, we're more likely to make decisions that are not just influenced by financial value, but also take into account social and environmental effects of our decisions as well. Ultimately, by making decisions that take a broader view, a more holistic view of value, this creates the potential to reduce environmental degradation. It creates opportunities to improve the well-being of people and ultimately reduce some of the inequalities that persist, both within nations and between nations. Social Value UK is one of a number of national networks that constitute Social Value International. Social Value International is a registered charity based in Scotland in the UK, and again, we share a mission to change the way the world accounts for value. With members now in over 45 countries and networks in around 26 at the time of this webinar, we are a growing network of networks representing any individuals and organisations that really do want to make decisions that are influenced by the environmental and social implications of what we do. A little bit about myself. I think it's always fair to know who's talking on these webinars. I'm Adam Richards. I've worked with Social Value UK for around 4 years now. I'm the Project Research and Training Manager, but I've been involved with SVUK for over 10 years as an active member and volunteer at the very beginning. Before we get into the particulars of the impact questions, I think it's always important to frame what we mean by social value, and it still has the potential that it means different things to different people. But fundamentally, there is a growing global consensus around what social value and social impacts mean. At the very core of what we're talking about is understanding changes. These are changes that affect people, so changes to people's lives. These are referred to as outcomes. Now, a person may experience more than one single outcome through the same activity. Some of those changes, of course, can be positive, some can be negative, they could be intended or unintended. We take a very holistic and broad view to understanding outcomes. We would talk about ourselves as having a consequence focus rather than just a goal focus approach. When we have multiple or numerous changes that people experience, we really need to be able to understand how important those different changes are. Because as it says, some changes are more important to people than others. If we can start to identify which are the most important changes and start to allocate our resources accordingly, we can increase the value of our activities. In order to do so, we need to understand how important or what is the value of those different changes. And that's what we mean when we talk about value. We're talking about the importance of different changes. We will dwell a little bit more as we go through the webinar on the importance of this idea around the relative importance. Essentially, what we mean by relative importance is how important one change is in relation to other changes experienced by the same people. If we go into valuation using the language of money, so we identify financial proxies, we can undertake the methodology of social return on investment. This is the fundamental difference between social value and social return on investment. Both use the same impact questions. Both are framed by the same principles of social value. The only significant difference is when we talk about valuation, if we use the language of money, we can do social return on investment. If we use numeric valuation, so we're quantifying how important a change is for a person, then we are talking about social value. So in essence, social value is a slightly broader banner than social return on investment. But again, both are focused on the same impact questions and both use the same principles of social value. So just as a little recap, we are really talking about changes to people's lives, explicitly talking about consequences. Because as soon as we start to talk about consequences rather than goals of an activity, we are far more open to the possibility and potential of understanding both positive and negative changes, and those that we intend to create, and potentially those that are created which are unintended. When we understand the relative importance, the relative value of these changes, we can really start to prioritise our resources, providing the most value through our activities. And again, if we use the language of money, we're talking about financial proxies or approximations. We can do social return on investment, where the value of changes experienced by people can be compared to the value of the investments or the inputs that are required, those financial and non-financial resources. Social value, importantly, does cover social, financial, and environmental outcomes. If we can identify a change to people, then we can do social value. We can understand the change, we can understand the extent of change, we can also understand the value of those changes. And that can really help us to identify where we can create most value through our activities. In summarising why we do this, yes, we absolutely need to measure. We fundamentally need to understand how much change has occurred. But we need to go beyond this. If we stop at the point of measuring our social value and conducting an SROI assessment, what we are essentially saying is, this is where we are at present. This is how much value we have created. What we are not saying is, we can create more value. To create more value is to start to manage our impacts, to start to identify where we can do more of the positive changes or stimulate more of the positive changes for people and reduce, if not eliminate, some of those negative changes for people. So measuring, impact measurement, social value measurement is the very beginning of the process. What we really need to be moving towards is where we start to embed these ideas into our organisation, into our thinking, so we start to manage the value that's being created. Just as financial value is managed, there are opportunities identified to reduce costs, to increase income. Social value, social accounting follows the same philosophy, where we have to first measure in order to manage. And if we're doing this all of the time, always striving to identify those insights and opportunities to increase the value that we are creating, we can start to talk about having a philosophy of maximizing social value. This is simply doing this all of the time, making as much of a difference as we can with the resources we have available. So maximizing, or optimizing if you prefer, doing as much as we can with the resources, always looking for opportunities to create more impact, because ultimately we are talking about creating positive changes in the lives of people. Impact management is a growing area, and as identified, there's a growing global consensus around some of these really important issues. But if we're honest, this is nothing new. We all do impact management. We will all identify opportunities to do things better, to reduce some of those unintended negative changes that perhaps our activities create in the lives of people. Ask yourself this question: what have you changed recently? Did you change your products? Did you change your services? Did you change any of your activities in order to create more value for people, to change people's lives more positively? If we are doing this, if we are doing this approach based on the involvement and the evidence that comes from our end users, our customers, our beneficiaries, if you like, then we are doing impact management. Impact management is looking at those different options, those different ways of delivering our services, delivering our products to increase the impact that is created. This is impact management. We are all doing it all of the time. We always make decisions. We will make a decision that where we believe that option A will create more value than option B. What we really need to move towards is a way where we are able to make some of those decisions based on greater levels of evidence, based on a more explicit and transparent decision-making process, one where it actually reduces the risk of not making the most appropriate, the most effective decision, the one that actually maximizes the impacts of our activities. So how do we do that? Well, at present, there is still a lack of legislation, standards, education, and so forth in terms of how to measure social value. But what we do have are a reasonably agreed set of principles of social value. These principles of social value have been in operation for a number of years now, and were identified through multiple stakeholder collaboration across the many networks of Social Value International. There are 7 principles of social value, beginning with the involvement of stakeholders. Stakeholders are involved to understand what's changed. They tell us, they inform us as to what has changed. The stakeholders are also involved in the valuation of those changes, the things that matter to them, those changes that they say are important. We will talk about issues around materiality. Materiality is a concept that says, are the changes both relevant and significant? Are they important enough, if you like, for us to include in our measurement and management processes? We will make judgments when accounting for social value. Those judgments will be informed by stakeholders. They will be informed by other sources of evidence, perhaps secondary research as well. But we will make judgments. So we need to make sure that we are, as well as being transparent, that we don't overclaim. Not overclaiming is essentially saying, what is the impact of our activities? And the difference between outcomes and impact is essentially the question that says, how much of the changes can we claim as being the result of our activities? I think this is a very important point because impact is often understood differently by different people. Some people may talk about impact being the long-term, the macro level effects. We don't necessarily disagree with that. But what we are saying is, regardless of how long the changes take to occur or how long they last and on which stakeholders they are experienced, impact is very much saying how much of those changes are as a result of the activities in question. So that is the principle of do not overclaim. I've already highlighted that as a result of making judgments, be they informed by research or our stakeholders, we will be transparent about those judgments. We will also verify the result. I'd like you to see these principles as always necessarily being applied to all activities, all assessments, but in a proportionate way. Verification is a prime example of this. If, for example, we are wanting to communicate results to the public or perhaps other stakeholders who are not going to see the detail of our analysis, perhaps an investor or a funder, there is a requirement for those results to be verified to give that audience sufficient confidence to use the results to inform their decision. Their decision could be, of course, to invest or not, to fund or not, or to continue to grant that public license to operate. So verification of the results in that circumstance should really entail independent assurance and audit of the results. But verification, again applied proportionally, should also involve stakeholders. The stakeholders whose lives we're talking about, whose changes we are assessing, they should also be involved in the verification process, providing us with the extra confidence that our results are accurate, truthful, and fair. So proportionality is certainly a watchword when applying the principles of social value, but they do need to be applied consistently throughout any social impact or social value assessment. Overlaying these principles is perhaps more of an implicit principle, and that is to be responsive. It's to use the data, to use the evidence, and start to think about making those changes. Again, that idea that impact management is very much about increasing the positive changes experienced by people and reducing some of those negatives. Essentially, that is saying to be responsive. We have some evidence. So what? So what are we going to do with it? What are we going to do to improve the lives of the people we are working with and for? So those are the principles of social value. And in addition, we have the 10 impact questions. The principles really provide a framework as to how we should go about accounting for social value. But in a more operational sense, we have the list of impact questions. We'll go through these in turn throughout the remainder of the webinar. But essentially, we'll start by asking, well, what is the problem, or what are the problems we're trying to solve? If there's a problem, there will be proposed solutions, potentially more than one solution. Within those activities, those solutions, they will affect people. So we need to ask the question of, well, who experiences changes? Who are the stakeholders? And when we refer to stakeholders within Social Value International, we're really talking about any individual or group of individuals that can affect or be affected by activities. Once we understand who those stakeholders are, and we'll talk about some of the real importance of understanding the different characteristics of our stakeholders, we can start to get a sense of what outcomes they have experienced if we're doing a retrospective evaluation, but we can also frame all of the impact questions as a more forecasted and prospective analysis. So rather than saying what did change for you or what have you experienced, we can frame the question as such as what outcomes are likely to be experienced. What does the stakeholder believe will happen for them as the result of an intervention or activity? As you'll see on the right-hand side of the table, this is mainly qualitative data. So this is coming from the stakeholder through different qualitative approaches, be they interviews or focus groups, for example. Once we understand the different relevant outcomes, those things that are changing for people, again, be they forecast or retrospective, we start to want to quantify those changes. And it's the quantitative data that really helps us understand the significance of the different changes, the magnitude, if you like. So the first two of those quantitative questions really do go hand in hand together. So we have some changes, the outcomes. We really want to understand how much of the change has happened, again, or likely to happen. In order to do so, we need to identify indicators. So that question there that says, how can we measure these changes, is really related to the different approaches, the different indicators we can use to measure the extent of change, or the delta of change, if you prefer. So now we understand what's changed, we understand by how much those changes have occurred. We then want to understand how important those different changes are, the relative importance of the different changes. We also need to think about how long we're going to measure the changes for. How long do they last? What's the sustainability of the different changes? And then the final question around the mainly quantitative data is again related to the impact question. How much of each change is caused by our activities? We will understand what has changed by how much, how important, and how long they last. That final question around how much is caused by us is very much saying, what is the impact that we as an organisation can claim? How much have we changed people's lives, and how important is our contribution? All of the preceding questions really allow us to address the final question, and we will address the final question throughout our approach to these impact questions. But what it really allows us to identify is which of the changes matter to the people who've been affected. Which of the changes are important enough for us as an organisation to manage? It may be that we find some of the changes that occur are not significant enough from the perspective of the stakeholder for us to include in our management approach. So it may be that having identified certain changes, perhaps the next year, we don't need to focus resources on measuring some of those changes. We can prioritise where we're going to create most impact. And again, these are informed by the principles of social value, the first, of course, being involve stakeholders. So all of these questions are informed by our stakeholders. It is not appropriate when doing social value or SROI for the analyst to sit in isolation and address these questions without speaking to stakeholders, which raises the very important question of who answers the questions. In most cases, it will be the people whose lives are affected or are likely to be affected by a particular activity. There will be certain circumstances where stakeholders are perhaps unable to provide some answers, be it down to their age or perhaps cognitive impairments, but other stakeholders will be able to assist us in this process. Another factor for us to consider is how much precision we require when asking these questions. What level of detail do we need? How large should the sample size be? What level of accuracy? What level of relevance do we need? It's summed up by the phrase, enough precision for the decision. So there's a consistent set of questions here that can be asked to the appropriate stakeholders, but the level of data or the level of precision required when asking these questions is variable. If, for example, we want to change government policy, and that's going to affect thousands, if not millions of people's lives in a potentially very significant way, the decision will be very costly, and it will be very difficult and expensive to reverse that decision if we wish to. So the level of precision required to support that sort of decision at policy level is very high. We need a high level of precision and rigour. If, for example, we are looking within an organisation and we're looking to make a small change, a very operational change, maybe looking at how we deliver a particular service or an element of that service. And again, that decision will not have such impact on so many people's lives. It will not be as costly. It will be something that we could reverse if we find out that that decision was not as effective as we'd previously hoped. The level of precision required to support that decision is not as high as it would be for, say, a policy level decision, or maybe even to change the mission statement of an organisation. So as we go through these questions, there's a consistent requirement to involve stakeholders, but there's also a consistent reminder of enough precision for the decision. If the data is not good enough to support the decision, that is a problem. But if we are wasting resources collecting more and more data that is not necessary, that is a waste of resources. It's a waste of our resources. It's also likely to be a waste of time, the time of the people who we are collecting data from. So we have some social value principles. They provide a framework. And here is a set of questions that really help us structure our thinking as to how we measure, manage, and maximize the social value of our activities. There are some really helpful documents on the Social Value UK and Social Value International websites, and they are absolutely open source, so please do have a look at them at some point. At the very least, we have a guide there, Maximise Your Impact. It's a guide designed explicitly for social enterprises, social and creative enterprises, but it really is applicable to all form of enterprise. We also have a very brief document on the 7 principles of social value, but do have a look at the website, Social Value UK and Social Value International. There's a range of other resources that are all open source. So delving into these impact questions now. So first of all, questions 1 and 2 very much go together around what's the problem and what is the solution. So what is it we're wanting to address? It may not be a problem, but it could be an issue. So I think of certain examples. The problem, if we're talking about perhaps a cooperative organisation, it's not necessarily a problem, but there are issues there, and there will be solutions designed to address them. Now, the benefits of answering these questions, I hope they seem very logical and perhaps even common sense. But what we really need to start to think about is identifying the root causes of problems. So not just the overarching major problem, it's really being able to delve into the detail and say, well, what are the actual root causes of the problems? And thinking about those principles of social value, it creates the potential at the very outset to involve stakeholders. This can be included, stakeholders can be included in the design stage of a service. So before a product or service has been launched, we can absolutely involve stakeholders to really refine our approach, asking that key question of, are we going to effectively address the root causes of the problem? Doing so can also help us identify different partners. Perhaps other institutions, other organizations, or other individuals need to be involved to really create an effective solution. We can't be expected to do everything ourselves, but there will be others out there contributing to these changes as well. The risks of not doing so. Well, we could spend a lot of time and money. We could be using the resources of the individuals themselves who we're working with. We may not actually be making any difference. If we're not clear on the root cause or causes of the problems, we could be trying to address we could be providing a solution that does not address the problems in hand. Even more concerning, of course, we may even make a negative impact. Our activities could unintentionally create negative impacts in the lives of people. So all of this is about mitigating, reducing the risks of making a negative impact, but also increasing the likelihood that we create a more positive impact through our activities. So we need to think about the problem. We also need to think about the solution. Having done so, we start to think about, well, who are the stakeholders? At the moment, in terms of this webinar, we're going to focus very much on those people who experience changes as a result of our activity. But again, stakeholders is a very broad approach, individuals or groups of individuals that affect or are affected by activities. We need to involve stakeholders. We need to know who we affect. We need to try and create those effective relationships. These are the people we will need to collect evidence from. But if we go a little bit deeper, and rather than thinking about, for example, service users or beneficiaries or clients, and we start to think about the different characteristics that people have. Perhaps we have a group of people and there's differences. They have different characteristics that help explain why they experience our activities differently. These could be some of the more obvious things, perhaps around their age, their sex, where they live, perhaps. But it could be other characteristics, be it their level of family support they receive, their educational background. There are a whole range of characteristics that potentially help to explain why people have different experiences. As it says, this really can be the gold dust of customer insight. And it's again something I'm sure that we do naturally. I doubt very much that anybody listening to this webinar would say, we always treat everybody in the same way. We will identify people as having different needs, as having different characteristics that mean we need to work with them in a different way in order to get the most positive impacts through our activities. I think if we start to treat everybody in the same way, it's very likely that our activities will work for some people, but less effectively than others or for others. This can really help us to start identifying opportunities to not just reduce some of the negative impacts, but also increase some of the positives. We may find, for example, that, let's say, for example, people with low levels of family support are less likely to secure employment than people with a stronger family network. That provides us with some insight. This is again the gold dust. We then, as an organisation, are able to say, well, what can we do differently? What can we do differently now that we understand that the characteristic around level of family support is something that can really affect whether an individual is likely to secure employment or not? We can start to make some choices. We can support people in a different way. Perhaps we need to identify other partners who need to be involved to support some of those people we're working with. Without understanding the different characteristics of people and the implications of those characteristics on people's experiences, we are extremely limited in our ability to tailor and target our services accordingly. So essentially the risk of not doing so is exactly the opposite. We don't know who we are affecting, we don't know who has an effect on us, and we are seriously limited in our ability to tailor our services to create the most impact we can. So we understand our stakeholders, we know who they are, we know some of their characteristics perhaps. We now really want to understand what the changes are that they have experienced or are likely to experience. So again, when we talk about things that are changing for people, we're talking about outcomes. By understanding outcomes, we can really start to understand the effects of our activities. Outcomes go beyond outputs. Outputs are the summary of our activity in numbers. So let's say, for example, we're providing food to older people in a community. The output relates to the number of meals provided, the number of people provided with food. But there's a very important question that says, so what? So what are the effects of these different activities? Are they positive? Are they negative? We will only understand that when we start to ask questions about the outcomes. It's only the outcomes that show the effects of our activities. This is where we start to learn, and we start to perhaps identify unintended negative changes. It's at this point we may even make the decision that says we don't even need to understand how important these negative changes are. We want to do something about it. So that question 10, the impact question 10, which says which changes matter enough to the people affected. We may even at this stage be able to identify that a negative change is occurring and we want to do something through our activities to reduce the potential this negative change to occur in the future. All of the impact questions from this point onwards really do help us refine our stakeholder segments as well. So previously we identified what we believe would be some of those characteristics, be it the age, the sex, or the location of a person perhaps. When we start to understand data or evidence around outcomes, this can help us refine our segments, perhaps confirming some of our judgments made, or perhaps helping us refine them in a little bit more detail. I'm sure by now you're seeing a reasonably consistent pattern. The benefits of addressing these questions mean we can increase the positive impacts of our activities. If we don't do so, the risks of not doing so is we may not even know if we're creating any positive impact whatsoever. Even worse than that, we could possibly be using resources to make some people's lives worse. And again, thinking about these impact questions working together, if we understand our characteristics, those segments of stakeholders, if you like, We may know that segment A experienced positive changes, whereas segment B experienced some negative changes. That allows us to do things differently. That's the insight that we need to be able to not just measure the impacts of our activities, but manage them going forward as well. So we've now done the qualitative stage where we've understood the stakeholders, and we've also started to think about the outcomes that those people are experiencing. We've identified the changes that we would consider to be relevant or that the stakeholders would inform us are relevant. We can do this through some of those really logical questions. Questions such as, so what? And what we mean by that is, so what changed? So what changes were you hoping for? Were they all positive? Were there any negative changes? Did anybody else experience changes? And again, we start to think about other stakeholders. Perhaps family members were affected. Perhaps a local neighbourhood or community were affected. If we think about the analogy of dropping a stone into a calm pond, you see the different ripples. The different ripples are both the different stakeholders and the different effects, those consequences, those outcomes that our activities generate, be they positive or negative. There is an open source document on the Social Value UK and Social Value International pages. This is the Standard on Applying Principle 2, and it's the Part 1 document, Creating Well-Defined Outcomes. So well-defined outcomes are identified by asking these questions, or questions very similar to these, to the appropriate stakeholders. So we've now done the qualitative stages. We've identified who the stakeholders are and the things that have changed for them. We now want to start to assess these changes in a quantitative sense. So questions 5 and 6 go together. Questions 5 and 6 fundamentally are asking us, how are we going to measure the extent of change or the delta of change? What indicators are we going to use to do so? And that will tell us how much change has happened, or again, if we're looking to forecast, how much change we expect to see. By doing so, again, it can help us refine our segments. We may now find out that segment A and segment B both experience positive change, but to differing extents. Perhaps we find out that segment A moves 80% on a positive change, whereas segment B only moves 20%. Again, that's insight. That's insight that allows us to say, what are the different characteristics between segment A and segment B that can help us refine our services so that segment B perhaps receive a different level of service? And this is really what we're doing, tailoring and targeting our services to those different segments, understanding and appreciating those different characteristics that help us use our resources most appropriately. We can also start to set targets at this stage. We can start to ask questions to ourselves and to our stakeholders about the expected levels of change. Without targets, it's very difficult to hold ourselves to account. I'm sure most of us, if not all, would have financial targets, but there is a question as to how many of us have social-related targets, targets related to changes that people experience in their lives. If we can start to think about setting targets, we will be more likely to have a mentality, a philosophy within the organisation where we're always striving for greater impact, a philosophy of impact thinking, if you like. And the risks of not doing so, well, again, we have a reduced ability to tailor our services. We will continue to treat everybody the same, assuming that everybody experiences the same changes to the same extent, which we know is unlikely to be the case. And of course, again, we may continue to make some people's lives worse. None of us intend to do this. Nobody intends to make people's lives worse. And it's actually quite hard to hear sometimes that we may do so unintentionally. But the only way to redress that situation is to first of all understand if that is occurring and then do something about it. So again, measurement being the precursor to being able to manage the impacts of our activities. So we now understand what's changed for people, and we understand by how much change is happening for different people. But we still don't know which of those changes are most important. Just because one stakeholder has moved 80% in one outcome and 20% in another does not tell us that the 80% change is more important or less important than the 20% change, for example. The only way to understand the importance of the different changes is to use a consistent unit of measurement. In doing so, we're able to compare these different changes. Change A and change B, we can compare when we have the same language. That same language has to be quantitative. We have to understand the relative importance using numbers. But it's very, very important that this is informed by stakeholders. We will all make value judgments. We do this implicitly. We will all have an idea of which are the most important changes in people's lives. But it's essential that we involve the people with lived experience, or those again who are likely to experience changes, and allow them to inform us as to which are the most important changes in their lives. This allows us to target again and tailor our services, really using our resources, focusing them where we can create most value. If we do not do so, we absolutely have no ability to understand from the perspective of our stakeholders which changes are most important and then allocate our resources accordingly. We may make a judgment, a value-based judgment that could be correct, but equally, we could make a value-based judgment that is incorrect. We could focus our resources to create more of outcome A than outcome B. And if we were to ask our stakeholders, perhaps they would tell us that outcome B is of very little importance to them. Again, there is a real risk that we could make a wrong decision, and therefore we will focus on changes that are not as important as others. There's a great phrase I like to use: value is in the eye of the stakeholder. Value is in the eye of the stakeholder. This is taken from a guy called Peter Scholten, based in the Netherlands, who's one of the real pioneers around the social value movement. If you think about value being in the eye of the stakeholder, it absolutely resonates and reminds us that we need to involve stakeholders in order to understand how important these different changes are. So we understand what's changed, we understand the extent of change, or the delta of change, and how important these changes are. We need to also think about the sustainability of those changes, the duration of those changes. We need to think about this because we want to ensure that positive changes are reasonably sustainable, and hopefully that any negative changes are not sustainable. But if we don't ask the question as to how long these changes last, and effectively think about how long we need to measure these changes, we are very limited in that ability, or that understanding and awareness. When we have this information, it can help us, again, prioritize our resources to create those, or to try and facilitate those changes that are more sustainable than others. And again, without doing so, we have no ability to, or a reduced ability to, manage the impacts. We may even create some positive changes that are just not sustainable. Perhaps people revert back to the same situation, or even worse. If people want to experience a positive change for a period of time and it doesn't occur, then people can revert back to previous situations, or perhaps regress to an even worse position than when they started. All of these questions, as a reminder, is about identifying insight. Yes, it allows us to measure and communicate our impact to people, but fundamentally, it really allows us to understand what our activities are doing, what are the effects, how important those effects are, and how long they last, allowing us to make decisions to prioritize our resources. The final impact question, where we would involve stakeholders explicitly, relates to this question 9, of how much change is caused by our activities, or how much of each change is caused by our activities. This again is the impact question. This is the question that allows us to identify how much we are contributing to the different changes in people's lives. It does help us to avoid overclaiming. We don't want to go to other people and say, these are the changes that are being created, this is how important they are, and it's all down to us. Because there has to be an honesty and an integrity that accepts that other people, other individuals and organizations, were likely to be involved in creating those changes, and there is always the potential that some of those changes could have occurred without us. This can help us identify potential partners as well. This is not I don't want people to see this as a negative connotation of almost giving value away. It's very much about being honest and having that integrity, but it really does provide positive insights. Perhaps we identify that a group of stakeholders, yes, they experience positive changes, but that those positive changes are also dependent on other organizations. Well, those other organizations could be potential partners going forwards, allowing us to co-create more value than perhaps we could do in isolation. It also allows us to think about the counterfactual or the deadweight possibilities, identifying people who perhaps would have changed without us. Imagine the situation where stakeholders inform us that yes, I've experienced positive changes, but they're reasonably confident that they would have occurred without our intervention. Well, there is a real potential there, there's a risk that our resources are being used ineffectively. And more so, it also means that we're supporting some people who would have changed without us, potentially at the expense of other people who we would have had a more positive effect on. If we don't ask this question, there is a real risk that we overclaim. We present our results to external audiences who will struggle with the credibility of our results. We'll really start to question and scrutinise our approach. But also, importantly, we allocate resources in areas where we are not creating any additionality, where we are not creating impact. And of course, we could also duplicate our efforts with others. We could be working to solve a problem that other organisations are already addressing, and our impact is therefore significantly reduced. So real positive insights can be gained from all of these impact questions. And what they all lead into is the question around which are the changes that matter most to the people whose lives are affected and are therefore important enough for us to manage. So we may identify 5 or 6 outcomes, that these changes that occur for people, but perhaps we realise through our assessment that only 3 or 4 of them matter enough to the people whose lives are affected. Therefore, next time, next quarter, next year, we don't need to measure those changes. It allows us to focus our resources in terms of measurement. We cannot allow measurement to become an industry of itself. It has to be something that is useful and effective to our organisations, allowing us to create more positive impacts in the lives of people. It really does help us to manage impacts. By understanding which are the most important changes that people experience, we can focus our attention and our resources accordingly. It allows us to communicate our impact to others. The examples provided there, such as investors and funders, are all external audiences, but equally it allows us to have those conversations internally as well. And often the results of social impact assessments often reinforce our gut perceptions. Perhaps we already know some of this information, but it gives us some evidence, it gives us some information that allows us to be more confident when making decisions. Perhaps it allows us to make that decision that says, well, we have outcome A, B, and C our stakeholders are experiencing, but outcome C just isn't important to our people. Let's not focus some resources on that. Let's try and create more of the other changes which are more important to people. If we don't do so, we're just going to potentially waste time, waste money and other resources. We're going to collect evidence that simply does not help us make better decisions, does not help us manage our impact. It simply restricts our ability as well to make improvements. It does not provide that opportunity to create greater impacts year on year. We're going to spend a lot of resources and time collecting data that is of no use. So why is all of this important? Just as a reminder, we need to make decisions that are informed by financial, social, and environmental effects. We need to do so in order to reduce the rising social inequality and the environmental harm that is perpetuated through the decisions that we make through our organisations and our activities. Please do have a look at the websites, Social Value UK and Social Value International. There's a free newsletter that can be signed up on both websites. And please do join us for the next webinars, going into a bit more detail around these impact questions. Thank you very much.